roots of psychiatry have to do with control, power, and alienation from certain groups of people who were uncomfortable to be around. They were locked up in these places to get them out of the way. The history of psychiatry, I think, really is related to institutions.
Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London was one of the world's first psychiatric institutions. Commonly referred to as Bedlam, the hospital was little more than a warehouse for those deemed mad. Inmates were confined to cages, closets, and animal stalls, chained to walls and flogged, while the asylum charged admission for public viewings. In the 18th century, William Batty was the first to promote that his institutions could cure the mentally ill. Batty's madhouses made him one of the richest men in England, though his treatments were every bit as inhumane as those practiced in Bedlam, with not a single patient cured. His financial success triggered a boom in the asylum business and an opportunity for psychiatrists to cash in on this new growth industry.
This was an era where, on both sides of the Atlantic, specialized institutions for the mentally ill are beginning to be built in large numbers. Those institutions date back certainly to the beginning of the 18th century, and in a few cases even earlier than that. But the explosive growth of an asylum sector, of asylumdom, as some historians have called it, is very much a 19th century phenomenon. It's that period when the state is persuaded to invest tax dollars in building these places.
But while those who ran the institutions were getting rich, psychiatrists yet lacked the credibility to maximize their cash flow.
In order to justify their profession, they needed to come up with these biological solutions, or they didn't have any profession. The only way for them to solve that was to attempt to start believing that these people that were suffering from emotional disorders was from a biological basis.
Whatever was done to make this person more manageable would be simply called a treatment. And the sad reality is that many of these so-called treatments were, in essence, torture.
The near-drowning devices that were developed in this period, for example, must have been appallingly frightening. For example, one device involved putting the patient into a coffin, closing the lid, and dumping it into a bath of water, and then opening it up and trying to revive the patient. There were a range of these things, and the mortality rate was very, very high.
Psychiatrists next sought to give credence to their practices by cloaking them in the language of medicine. This repackaging of treatment became known as the medical model.
Somebody who's really hyper and manic, if you're wrapped up in a cold sheet and dunked into some water, you're going to quit acting manic because that's a punishing treatment. But as soon as the symptoms started to go away, they started to believe that somehow by wrapping them up and dunking them in cold water, it was draining the toxics out of their body. So they built the medical model around that.
Pushing the biological theory of mental illness a step further, an American, Benjamin Rush, put forth the idea that insanity was caused by too much blood in the head. The cure? Remove the blood by any means possible. Restraint, cold water, bleeding, even terror. And with that, a new medical model was created.
Benjamin Rush was probably the most famous American physician of the Revolutionary era. Rush was known as the master bleeder. He bled his patients for madness. He also invented something called the tranquilizer. It's a chair that looks a little bit like an electric chair. The patient was confined in this apparatus, sometimes with cold water applied to his or her head, for some hours at a time, and Rush announces in a letter that he's invented this new contraption and dubbed it the tranquilizer.
Rush's often lethal procedures were detailed in his 1812 textbook, which remained psychiatry's authoritative source for the next 70 years. He was so revered that in 1965, Rush was enshrined as the father of American psychiatry on the seal of the American Psychiatric Association. As the 1800s wore on, psychiatry's mounting failures at curing madness threatened their financial bottom line, forcing them to invent new medical models.
The cures promised were not delivered. So by the 1860s and 70s, a growing mood of pessimism was covering Europe and North America, that effectively the new institutions were ever growing in size, but not growing in their effectiveness.
The 20th century brought more medical models. American psychiatrist Henry Cotton mutilated his patients by removing their body parts, declaring this a breakthrough in the treatment of mental illness.
The earliest target was the teeth and then the tonsils and the sinuses, but when patients didn't get better, the enthusiasts for this treatment then started to move down the body and to say, well, obviously patients have swallowed bacteria in their saliva, so stomachs need to go, spleens need to go, colons need to go.
As public outcry escalated over torture and maiming of patients, psychiatrists would invent new methods, each one hailed as the miracle cure. But each one was ultimately proven no more effective nor less brutal than the last.
This is a history of psychiatry, more or less, to damage the patient. I mean, this is a version of the original model, which was to chain them like animals.
If you're doing it to somebody because you insist that they have to change, and you're going to do that by turning the screws, you might say, whether it's with medication, restraint, whatever, that's torture. And a huge part of what psychiatry has done really comes down to torture.
As the 20th century progressed, psychiatry would continue to seek legitimacy by transforming itself into a medical discipline. But they succeeded only in creating more efficient ways of inflicting mental and physical torture and death, a legacy that has carried forward into modern psychiatry, with its most profitable medical model to date, the mass drugging of millions. But to do this, psychiatrists first had to shatter one of mankind's most cherished beliefs, decreeing that people were not what they thought they were.